I think that we all can agree that we make music with our whole body when we play the flute. And there are those of us who've been really captured by that idea and that experience. It has transformed our career in one way or another, or our teaching, which to me is that's all within the same umbrella. And it's a joy to be highlighted for that, and also to just get to share with your listeners, even though we don't get to give you those experiences of movement. Maybe it'll excite some of those listeners into going and trying some things that might be a little bit outside of their normal box for fluting.
Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi Begay, and this is episode 87, Dalcroze Eurhythmics and Integrative Education with Emma Shubin. Today's sponsor is brought to you by J&K Productions. Did you know that not only are they a production company for podcasts, but they are a recording company for musicians? Any musical recording needs that you may have, J&K Productions can fulfill that need. They have all the necessary equipment and expertise to record your next flute recording for college or graduate auditions, competitions, summer festivals, or a flute album. J&K Productions can record any setup imaginable, from solo flute, small chamber, flute and piano, and much more. Consider J&K Productions for your next recording project. Contact them at jkproductions.media. Welcome, everyone, to another Flute 360 podcast episode. Today, I am with Emma Shubin, and her episode launches the beginning of Series 19. Emma is a Dalcroze licensed and certified teacher and the director and co-founder of a nonprofit organization called Integral Steps, which is based in Colorado. We talked today about how integrating movement within our bodies can help us musicians express our musical intentions through our instrument. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be on this podcast.
Oh, thank you for your time, and I can't wait to pick your brain.
Very good. Well, tell me, what can I let you know about my journey that will help your listeners?
Yeah, exactly. I think that first question is where we are going to start. Let's talk about your background, just so that way people know a little bit about you and your work.
Awesome. I am a Dalcroze teacher, which means that I teach music through movement, which is one of the parts of the pie of the things I do. I think more and more as musicians, we are finding ways to make our living as musicians in a way that's meaningful to us, but also has many different facets. And for me, I've always felt like I'm somebody who has a lot of interests, maybe a few too many. And it was always tricky for me to narrow down to just one thing. So even though the flute was at the fore for what I was loving to do and the way I wanted to express myself as a musician, it incorporated so much more than that for me. And so in my younger years, I was a horseback rider. I loved working with animals. I really loved making music and being in chamber groups. I loved traveling. And recently I found, in one of my classes in grade school, you had to make a little projection of what you really wanted to do. And I found it so interesting that even at that age, I really wanted to work with animals. I wanted to play my flute and I wanted to travel the world. And one of the pieces of that little portfolio that I had made was this idea that music can transform us and that it's a universal language. I grew up going to the Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music, which is just outside of Keene, New Hampshire. My father was on the faculty there. And this idea that the language of music could bring peace between warring nations had a huge impact on my growth as a musician. So when I was growing as a flutist and later went to Interlochen Arts Academy, it still remained in the front of my heart, and my wish was to grow as a musician in a way that I felt could really work on the growth and the connection between people.
Beautifully said.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons I feel so grateful these days to be a Haynes Ambassador clinician is that I have the opportunity more and more to travel and work with young flutists and flutists within communities, so of all ages and levels, and really find ways to connect this beautiful instrument, which really is like perhaps closest connected to our voice, to our love of music and our love of creating something together that wasn't there before. And I think that the flute has a unique power to really speak to people in that way.
Yeah, I agree.
It might be the closest to the human voice.
Yeah, Robert Dick talked a lot about that in his series. So if any Flute 360 listener out there wants to check out that series, feel free, because a lot of his concepts and ideas come from the human voice. And so I'm just kind of making that connection for myself and anyone who wants to make that connection with me as well. But he was really into the voice and how the flute is an extension of what's already inside of us.
Well, I love that. And I'm going to use it as a little bit of a segue, because in the Dalcroze world, we talk a lot about the body as the first instrument. Through learning music through movement and learning music through the body, we are really transforming our understanding and our connection to any musical instrument and also to the material that we're trying to express. And when we have that kind of ownership over our music, then we're able to more confidently but more truthfully express what we find within the music to our audiences.
No, that's great. I always tell my students that the flute is just an amplification of what's already inside. It's just amplifying your thoughts and your movement and how you're using your body. And then the flute is just magnifying that. And so to hear you and other professionals resonate that idea, I get excited because I feel validated as a teacher.
I agree. I think that when we perform music that feels really truthful to us, we're able to stand on stage with more confidence. But whether or not it's on stage or that we're communicating with our students or our colleagues, and they also feel that resonance and they feel like they're working with somebody who really believes in what they do and really finds what they do to be meaningful to them and really opens up that avenue of communication. And I think what I have found is that when I'm working for a place of more authenticity, I feel really good about what I do from a day-to-day basis as a flutist and a musician. And that really helps me to move forward in my career as a flute player, but more as somebody who, I think sometimes we feel like we have to justify our work as a musician or an artist and say, yes, we do what I love, we do what we love, and that's why we work so hard at it. But really, I think music calls the people who work in that field. We really feel connected to that, and it's really an expression of who we are as a human. And so it's not necessarily that we choose or don't choose to be a musician. It's just part of our fabric as a human being. And so when we're doing it in a really authentic way, whether it's for a living or just for enjoyment, it can really change and transform our own experience when we feel that we're doing it truthfully.
I love that. That's amazing. So one of the things that we will be discussing today is Dalcroze Eurhythmics. So let's talk about Dalcroze and how did you get into using this methodology and being a certified licensed instructor?
Well, I have such a vivid memory of my first Dalcroze experience. It was my first required class in my undergraduate conservatory degree. And I entered into this big hall that was full of a lot of beautiful light. And the teacher told us that our first task was to step to the beat of the music that she played. And what captured me was the music that she was improvising sounded a lot like folk music, Eastern European folk music. And my family is Eastern European. I'm Ukrainian and Lithuanian. And I just remember thinking to myself, it's amazing to hear such beautiful music. And here I am, and it feels like the music is being made for my movement. and is matching the affect of how I am actually moving through the space. And then as the exercise continued, we were supposed to follow the rhythm of her music. And so it's what we call a tempo dynamic follow, or what we would just call a follow. And so she changed the character and the mood by changing the tempo and the articulation and the dynamic of what she was playing. And as this class progressed and we were working in different patterns and then eventually in compound meter, at the end of the class, I realized, wow, I have never experienced music this way. And it feels like the way I learn. I've always been a very kinesthetic person who liked to do things and be quite active. And it just felt really amazing to experience music in a whole-bodied way. And it felt like something I could directly translate into my experience internally that I have with a great piece of flute music, and that I could actually take that experience and transform it into something that could be meaningful through my air, through my interpretation of a piece. And it seemed to strengthen my ability to communicate through the flute. And so I really started to make this connection right away that we are our instrument, and that the more experiences I had in my body of all the different aspects of music, the more comfortable and confident I would feel on the musical stage. And people started to ask me, you know, what kind of studying do you do? Who do you work with? All of those questions that we do ask each other just out of maybe courtesy. But I could tell that there was a question behind all of that with how I was choosing to interpret my pieces and understand the rhythmic vitality within my music, because, Lorna McGee is a teacher that I really admire, and I've had the opportunity to work with quite a bit at the Pender Island Flute Retreat. And she, I once heard her say that rhythm is character. And so I felt that the Dalcroze work really helped develop my character of each piece and helped me become more true to the music from the inside out. So it wasn't from a score, it was from the experience of the music that transformed my ability to interpret a score, and also to sonically take something in through my ears and have it really mean something to me. So it didn't become an exercise of how to phrase something more musically, quote unquote, but it became an exercise of how to internalize something musically to make it expressive through the instrument.
There are so many great nuggets in that. I just want to pull some out just to highlight for the listeners and to help my learning process, because I'm learning so much. You mentioned that integrating this movement while learning a score gives you confidence on stage. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, I feel that learning to use your body to understand the music 100% changes my connection to the score, and then therefore my confidence with the material that I'm performing.
That's amazing. So do you think that it could potentially lessen performance anxiety by approaching it this way? So that way, like you said, you become the music. And so therefore it just, comes out of you organically.
For me, it was one of the biggest transformations in my interpretation of pieces, and also my feeling of being nervous on stage was this work. And I didn't really realize that I didn't feel confident with either the notes in front of me, or whether or not I felt like I confidently was interpreting a piece well enough to some, external standard, whether it was a teacher standard or what I felt would be the best, until I started to work in this method and realized that I could transform and discover my own interpretation and be really confident in that. And so for me, that was one of the most important transformations for my approach to how I worked on my confidence in performance and whether or not I had stage fright.
So I'm putting myself in this position of imagining myself moving and dancing while I'm learning the score and practicing, and maybe with the flute, maybe without the flute, right? And I'm seeing myself absorb this music, right, internally, and I can see how bringing it to life and putting it out into the world makes it more authentic, where I can almost sense that confidence where, you know what? It doesn't matter what person X, Y, or Z is thinking because this is how I embody it. This is how I hear it. And so therefore, it is what it is, and I'm happy to bring life to it rather than worrying about the judgment of others.
Well, I think you bring up a really valuable point. Music happens in the present time. And I think the performer spends so much time developing from their past experiences and looking forward to the future. But really, we're in the moment when we perform. And how to become comfortable with that reality, I think, is a big piece of our development as flutists and musicians. I mean, that really applies to anything, I suppose, in life. But my Dalcroze teacher, her name is Lisa Parker, and she, developed the programming in Boston. And there was, degree programs, and there's a school and a way you can study in that area of the world. And now we have one, of course, in the Rocky Mountain region, which is where I work and teach. And, we use that programming now with my nonprofit Integral Steps. But Lisa said to me, the amazing thing about the body is it's in the present. The mind can wander to the future and definitely wanders to the past, but the body is present. And that's why this work is so valuable.
Oh my gosh, I have goosebumps over here. Seriously, I mean, it's just like, it's mind-blowing, and it almost seems too good to be true. And almost it simplifies things for me.
Well, for me, I think that we can sometimes get so lost in the complications of how we interpret every bit of minutia within our music. And we need to take the attention and the care to have a warm, resonant sound and a connection to our music and a connection to our audience. But that also requires a connection to ourself and our first instrument, our body. And for me, this way of developing kind of the multifaceted parts of ourselves through working with the body and the mind and even the emotions has really transformed how I do my work in the larger world. Integral Steps grew from a wish to work with individuals, families, and communities through music, movement, psychology, creative arts, and even biology. I have another degree, which is in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I really have learned to value the parts of myself that are multifaceted and have all of these interests because it brings more to my music making and more to my flute playing and more to my ability to connect and teach with people. And when I'm out there in the world giving workshops about Dalcroze or working with flutists and the use of movement and the connection of music in their bodies through their instruments, it informs all of that when I embrace the different things that I love.
I love it. This is partly my fault, and it's just because the energy and the topic is so invigorating for me. We just launched full force in. But I want to take it one step back. We have been using this term Dalcroze. And for the listeners who may not know what Dalcroze is, could you give us an explanation of this methodology?
Absolutely. I was excited too. So we got ahead of ourselves. So Dalcroze education is a method of teaching music through movement. Émile Jacques Dalcroze was a composer and a pianist. He headed up the Geneva Conservatory. He famously was even asked to leave his post because he dared to have people take off their shoes and bare their ankles in his experiments, to have students try rhythmic exercises to help connect and develop their ears to their solfege work and their ear training work. His real thought was that if we could embody our music, it would change it from being an, kind of above the shoulders kind of exercise, a head and kind of neck activity where you're just thinking about the music and tied to the score, to something that was truly more embodied and understood throughout the whole being. He really felt that teachers could draw upon their own experience and their own culture to reach their students. He was a real mover and a shaker and a very forward thinker. And there's wonderful things that he wrote. You can read his own writings. At the time, there were even those caricatures of like the bobblehead kind of caricatures written with, kind of jokes about his work. He was a real cultural icon during his time, but he was also considered the grandfather of music education. So if you're familiar with Orff or Kodály, Kodály studied with Dalcroze and Orff studied with Kodály. So there's a real lineage there within our music education in this country as well as throughout the world. And there is still a lot of us Dalcrozians who are out there, and I would say that our work is even on the rise in this country. It's now possible to study in many schools throughout the country, but you can even study over Skype with some of these and do some distance learning when it comes to Dalcroze education. And for me, I have the opportunity to travel and teach people about this method, which precurses a lot of what we may learn in our basic music education classes, but there's always a unit given to Dalcroze. It's just hard to find a Dalcroze certified or licensed teacher. So when people train to get their certification, they're receiving a credential that allows them to use the name Dalcroze in their title, but also signals to the outside world that you received a really rigorous training in improvisation, not only from the keyboard, but from your own instrument, solfege, which trains the ears and the eyes, Eurhythmics, which is the portion of class where we work on movement and becoming the music in our whole body, as well as pedagogy. So we work on our methodologies, and something called plastique animé, which was very unique to Dalcroze. It was a choreography of the musical score, but not from a dancer standpoint necessarily, but from the use of responding to the music and understanding the musical score. And in Dalcroze's highest ideal, he felt that people would be able to see a plastique animé of a group of people moving to a piece of music without sound and be able to internally hear the score that they were observing. So a really powerful and well encompassed method that has all these branches, I think makes for a very strong musician and a very strong teacher. And it has, my journey to become a Dalcroze teacher was a very long journey and kind of step by step. But for me, it was really undeniable that in those first experiences, I had stumbled onto a method that encompassed training the whole person. And that truth of owning my music so completely would really transform how I played as a flutist. And it really has supported my development through my music and allowed me to continue to grow as a flute player and to see myself more and more and to hear myself better and better and to stretch my skill set as a whole musician, but also as a flute player.
Wow. In case somebody is interested in pursuing receiving this Dalcroze certification, I know you are licensed and certified. Is certification the basic training, or is the...
Yes. So certification is our first level, which allows you to teach children and adult beginners. And then licensure allows you to teach adults and professionals, in advanced younger students as well.
Okay.
And so usually it takes anywhere between 2 and 4 years to finish your certification, and then usually an additional 2 years to do your licensure.
Wow.
Yeah. So my story was a little unique in that I entered Dalcroze certification land and programming as an undergraduate. And at the time at the school where I was at the Longy School of Music in Boston, this was only offered to graduate students. But my solfege teacher noticed, so this is a little bit of my background, noticed that I was singing everything beautifully, but often saying the wrong syllables. And my rhythm parts of my class were going very well, but he was curious about this. And over time he said, Emma, my wife is a little bit like this. I think you might have a little bit of dyslexia with reading your notes, that you're flipping your lines and your spaces so vertically. Because I'm an avid reader, I've never felt that I've had trouble processing information like that. But I always felt uncomfortable and a little worried that I wouldn't be accurate with my note reading. And so he said, the Dalcroze people would be a really big asset. So the first time I ever worked with my Dalcroze teacher, I remember going downstairs to the Dalcroze room, and she was waiting for me, and we started to work on these exercises of her playing a simple melody for me, and I would gesture it with my hand and my arm. And so if the melody went up, my arm would go up. If the melody would go down, my arm would go down. And then I would do the same thing, but sing back what I was hearing. And then I would identify that with numbers. So I'd sing back and we'd figure out the numbers. And then pretty soon she had me over at the time, a chalkboard. I guess we don't use those so much anymore, but at the chalkboard, I would sketch out what I was hearing spatially. And then before I knew it, I was completing these dictations where I knew the note names and the function of the notes before I even wrote it down. And it was such a transformation for me to realize that I could attach what my ears were bringing in with something that I knew so clearly in my mind. And it transformed my whole life, because I didn't really know that before that point. I probably hadn't really been reading my music. I had been maybe slowly processing what I was reading, but I was more improvising things that sounded in the style of the pieces I was working on. And then over time, I would refine it, make it really accurate. But then I would get out on stage and look at that music, and it would feel a little foreign to me. And I'm sure many of our listeners have experienced this, where all of a sudden you look at a piece of music and you're like, I don't know if I've seen this before, even though I've practiced it. And, they call that state-bound learning, where you learn things in one state and then you go out on stage and it feels like a completely different experience because you're in a different state. And this was the first time that I realized that I had the tools, and through my body, I had the ability to transform my experience of this piece of music processing that I had never quite felt comfortable with, but hadn't been able to articulate to anybody why I wasn't feeling so comfortable learning in a full etude or 3 or 7 in a week. And at the time I worked with Robert Willoughby. He was my undergraduate teacher, and he was amazing, by far one of the most transformative teachers I've ever worked with, and a kind gentleman. And the music was always the most important thing in what he taught us. But it was demanding. We would go away and, prepare a sonata, a couple of etudes, 4 or 5 excerpts, a Telemann Fantasia, every week, and come back and be expected to really have those prepared. And it was a lot of music for a young musician, but I'd already been away from home training for a couple years at that point. And I wanted to be able to meet that challenge, but was struggling with feeling like I could be accurate in my my performance of those in the performance of that material in my lessons. And for him, it wasn't about making a monster flute player. It was about making a really truly in-depth, consummate flutist who knew their music and really put the interpretation of the music at the fore. And each one of us were such unique students. And so he really supported my exploration and my development in this world of Dalcroze, and discovering my own way of learning, and really moving through, things that felt like challenges ended up being this method transformed my life. And I had really ended up in more serious study because I'd wanted to improve my ear and eye connection with my body. And here it is. And it's really shaped my whole life as a flutist and as a musician and a teacher.
Wow. Yeah, I almost feel the sense of relief from you that you found something that worked for you and your style of learning and the way your brain worked. Literally, it just sounds like a sigh of relief. Yeah, I can relate to that on so many different levels. Like you're searching, you're trying to find the answer. And then when you find it, you're like, oh, this works for me. Where has this been all my life?
I think that so many of us wish to find our silver bullet, something that will really make it all click for us. And the reality is that learning is circuitous, and we layer every experience helps us get to the next place. And it's more about this long game of a consistent effort over time and a real wish to discover something about ourselves. And I think music is this beautiful platform that allows us to discover so much about who we are as humans. And for me, I have just felt such joy in being able to work on the things that I don't, it's very vulnerable to not be our best all the time and to let people see that we have things that we're growing and working on. But I think that people really respond when they can feel that somebody is being an open and generous musician and is comfortable with their own lacks and is also comfortable with their expressive joys and their expressive successes. And I think that one of the transformative experiences in my life has been that I can create music at a very high level at any moment if I really choose to put myself into the shoes of the music and really try and fill that. And that therefore I really want my skill level to match my expressive wish. And so by working on developing my connection to the music through that skill level, which, sometimes we feel like technique and artistry are separate, but I think they're really the same. And, to me, sound is our technique, and technique is really kinesthetic memory and coordination. And the more coordinated I am, the more I'm able to connect musically for myself, but also for my audiences. And to me, that is at the heart of what the Dalcroze method allows musicians to do, is to connect to the music and develop skills and kind of expand their boundaries as musicians so that they can really find their own personal voice. And so there's like many moments of relief for me along the way as I'm trying something, because in a sense, the method allows you to fail in a really constructive way, because kind of part of our work is that we make tasks that really require multitasking. And so often you're having these big dissociations where your feet may be walking to the beat and your hands are clapping the division of the beat, or your feet are in 2 and your hands are in 3, or you're hearing a signal from a piano and it means if you're minor, you're working with a partner, and if it's major, you're by yourself, following the music. And there's all this response, and inherent in that is that in the training of it, you won't get everything right all the time. So you pretty quickly have to let go of this wish to be correct at all times. And therefore, you start to learn that, being unsuccessful means that you're actually finding your pathway to being the most successful you can be. And to me, that has become a really joyful experience of like, oh, I don't understand this. Now I better know I have a better knowledge of how to get where I would really love to be, whether it's a skill or a piece of music.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it seems, and I might have to take this out because I don't know if I'm going to say this the correct way. It almost seems backwards to the educational system here in the States, where, I could be wrong, but I remember being in like grade school and junior high and feeling like if I made a mistake, you're bad. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you got an F on your math test? Okay, maybe I needed to study a little bit more, but maybe not an F, maybe a C, right? I passed. Well, like growing up, a C was like, well, that's not an A. You missed 20 questions. But instead, seeing it as, wait a second, you received 70%. So you understand 70% of the concepts, and here's 30% more to grow. And this is giving you an opportunity to work towards that goal. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly.
Okay.
I think that really there's no such thing as getting everything perfect, even when we play all of our right notes and all of the right rhythms. There's always the next step. And so this method is really inherent in this method is the building in of working towards the next step and the acceptance of being kind of on a spectrum of growth versus a product-oriented destination. So I think music is so process oriented. And yes, of course, we have these moments of having a product. I'm going to go perform this, or I'm taking an audition. I need to be at a certain level of being able to produce something in a certain way. However, there's always the next step, whether it's within the interpretation or the character or the development of our sound. I think of this a lot, especially in connection to vibrato and sound production. I'm always trying to find a new way to be more authentic to my voice as a musician and to find a way that feels like I'm spinning the sound to my audience that is true to the music and also true to my connection with the interpretation of a piece. And I often think about how the quality of the rhythm inside of the music I'm playing, even when I'm playing slow things, the rhythm or the small divisions within the note, and how that affects, for example, my vibrato and my interpretation really affects the experience of the audience member, because they don't have the sheet of music in front of them or the prior knowledge of the work that we have done before we go out there on stage. They just are really there to receive and are happy to receive the music that we're creating in that moment.
Yeah, I love it. So speaking about this connection, when you work with your students, how much of this Dalcroze knowledge are you incorporating within that private lesson?
It's a great question. Often we're teaching lessons in a small space. And so I get this question a lot of how do you, if this is a full-bodied kind of a method, how do you incorporate it into your lessons?
Yeah.
And it's true that we want to incorporate the body, because I think that any technical issues that we hear and see on the instrument, or anything that feels like a block, the answer is within our bodies, because that is still our first instrument. And so I always strive to find ways to help students connect, not only to do things like connecting to the floor, but I often will have a tennis ball handy so that if a student is having trouble with the beat, for example, we can actually externalize the beat with a tennis ball by passing it from hand to hand. Or if we're working on being able to really feel like we are understanding what we're seeing, if we're working on our sight reading, having them practice saying note names out loud while they finger on their instrument. A lot of students don't connect that what they're interpreting with their eyes is directly connected to where their fingers go, even though that seems really obvious. I often have discovered that students are not feeling very comfortable with that connection. And I think it's true that we often attract like people into our studios. So I tend to have quite a few students who that connection is not very organic for them, where they're taking in information and they feel really confident that what they see, if they look at the second space on the staff, that's an A and that the third one is a C. That to them is not something always that is super concrete and clear. And, we could think that maybe that goes towards not doing as much general music education in classes, which is true in our schooling, and that we don't necessarily all gather around the piano every night to sing songs as they may have done 100 years ago. But I think that we also don't move as much as a culture, so we're not as connected and aware of our bodies. And these, of course, that's not a rule, but and I'm not trying to make an overgeneralization. But what I've seen in my students is a need to experience music more fully in their bodies. And so when I'm in a lesson, I try and find even small ways, because, one of the things that us flute players love to do is we love to stand up tall with our great posture, and we get really locked and really tight. And so even if it's something simple where we're rotating our ribs, or we are practicing a scale that goes up while we crouch down. So the movement of the body going down while we play our scale up, and then the opposite, vice versa, going up with our bodies while the scale goes down. All these little things helps bring awareness to the fact that we make sound on our instrument with our air, and that rhythm comes from the way we speak. It also comes from our heartbeat, and it also comes from our walking pace. One of the story goes that Dalcroze was observing his students leaving the classroom, and he saw that they could all walk in time down the stairs. And forgive me if any Dalcrozians are listening and know a different version of the story. But he was watching the students exit the classroom. He observed that they could walk in time with a really embodied and natural sense of pulse. But if he would ask them to, perform an exercise, it became a very disembodied kind of from the neck up experience for the student, for the listener. And so he was looking for ways to more embody the music so that the listener would feel engaged 100%, just like the performer would be engaged 100% with their music. And so for my students, I want them to own their music with their whole selves. So I often will ask them to do exercises where, that not only can they play it on their instrument, but can they sing it back to me? Can they sing it on letter names? Can they sing it with numbers, meaning that they know what the function of each note within the scale is? Can they say it on rhythms? And I have come up, here in Denver, we use a whole system of colors for rhythms, and people are welcome to reach out to me if they're interested in those, or we can come up with words. And a lot of people who work with young students use, fruits and vegetables and bug names and such for rhythms. But I actually have found for my adult students, they really enjoy getting to connect the prosody of language with music, because to them, all of a sudden, the shaping of a phrase becomes really clear, whereas before it would have felt really nebulous. Take these dots on a page and make the rhythm sound like X, Y, or Z. And that can be so tricky for us to interpret, that these dots are really are guideposts to expressing something that is a full-bodied feeling, or a rhythm that actually comes from the way that you would communicate something through speech. And so I want my students to get more of this global sense of how to interpret their music.
I love it. It's amazing. I remember at the Haynes booth and talking with many flutists who were willing to share their time. I remember a conversation with Ai Goldsmith, I believe her last name is, and she was talking about language and how when I think she studied in Italy or something like that, and she noticed that the way they inflect their language, like just saying bella. And she realized that, all of the great, or most of the great operas, come from that Italian tradition, right? And so she was noticing, oh my gosh, like the music has that inflection, and it's because of the Italian language. So that's what I'm pulling out from what you just stated.
Yes. I mean, I love the idea that I am interpreting a whole moment in time when I work on a piece of music, that there's more than just the notes on the page of Bach, but there's a whole era and a culture behind it. And, obviously I'm really invested in the Dalcroze work, but I think there are so many great pedagogies out there and great teachers who talk about how when you contextualize your piece and you consider the culture and the times and the sounds and the experiences of the composer who were writing it, it changes your interpretation and your feeling of a piece of music. And to realize that, English was not the first language of all of the Baroque, most of the Baroque writers, for example, that we tend to play on the flute. English was not their first language, if at all. And so to listen to languages that were actually being spoken around these composers, I have found it's very helpful for me to understand a little bit more of the articulation, for example, of Bach.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Oh my goodness. I have to move on, but I could literally sit here and just absorb like a sponge all day long with your knowledge. This is just seriously goosebumps. I mean, up and down both my arms.
Well, thank you, Heidi. It's been, to have met you at the NFA and to have this opportunity to talk with you on this podcast is a real honor, because I think I mentioned this in our podcast, but we are a really small community, as it were, yet we're part of a large community of music makers. And to me, every person is a musician, whether they are an instrumentalist or not. Music is something that we carry with us, whether it's for celebration or mourning or part of our day. And I couldn't imagine my day without music. I think most of us have a soundtrack for our life. And I grew up in a family of musicians. My father is a professional bassoonist, and my grandmother was an educator and a wonderful violinist and violist. So I feel so lucky that I have that lineage and that belief that music is possible to not only be the thing that we love and enjoy, but it can carve our path through the world. And it's nice to meet another like-minded person, because here you are doing this great podcast that can really have the opportunity to draw flutists together. And one of the reasons I've been so honored to be part of the Haynes family is that all of the colleagues I've met are just incredible humans on top of being just astounding flutists. And their belief in connecting communities is at the fore. And so when I met them through many of the different flute things that we do in our world, their excitement about the little nonprofit that I helped found, and that the idea that that we can create a place where people can grow, I think starts right here with a podcast that can bring listeners together under an umbrella of something that they really love, but also recognize that they're connected to the world around them. That's at the heart of Integral Steps' mission, to connect individuals, families, and communities, and to develop growth in all levels. So it just feels like we're resonating in the same kind of circles, as it were. And so I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Definitely. Speaking of community, is there something that we as a flute community can do to help your nonprofit organization, Integral Steps?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, of course there is. Well, as you know, with any small organization, to keep the lights on, we need the help of donations. Okay. And as one of my dear music friends once would always say at Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music, the former director would always say, there is no amount too small and no amount too large for a donation, which we would, of course, would help us a great deal, because as usual in that world, everybody's overworked and underpaid. What is kind of remarkable about Integral Steps is I'm the co-director and I'm a flutist. Our development director, Veronica Bolevsky, is a wonderful flutist. And our office manager, business manager, Sorsha Barr, is also a fantastic flutist. So there's a whole team of us flute players. We recently are working on a merger with the nonprofit Play It Forward Scholarship Program out of Atlanta, which was founded by a flutist, Jessica Sherer. And so that programming will allow students to volunteer their time in their community at local nonprofits, an hour-for-hour exchange for their private lessons. And so donations may seem kind of crass to ask for in a podcast kind of situation, but that sort of stuff supports all of these amazing families that want to grow and want to become great musicians and citizens and well-developed humans. And so that is such a big help. But where I'm really going with this is we have the Vancouver Flute Day coming up. And so a really great support would be any of you West Coasters who want to come up to Vancouver for a beautiful weekend. It's the weekend after Memorial Day. So I believe that's the 30th and the 31st of May. We're going to have a really wonderful panel of flutists who all were brought together through the Pender Island Flute Retreat and now have developed our own careers and our own paths. So we'll do things from orchestral work to masterclass to Alexander technique. That's with my dear friend and colleague, Roderick Seed, who has been a longtime supporter of Integral Steps and has helped the integrated flutist develop in the UK, which is the name of this festival. We'll have the wonderful Dr. Gabriela Minas-Brandes, who is a Alexander technique teacher, and she's Lorna McGee's Alexander technique teacher, will be working there with us. Long and McQuaid, and I believe that Haynes will be joining us, as well as Seattle Flute Works. Paul Hyung, who plays with the symphony, will also be with us for that weekend. And we're just thrilled that we have a chance to give back to our community. And so the other way that I would say is that not only coming to a great flute event and supporting your colleagues, whether it's this one or a different one, but, if you have a wish to have a more integrated approach to your flute playing and you want a workshop or a concert or a class, and I can help connect dots for you or bring somebody that you would really enjoy to your own backyard. I always want to support my colleagues and my friends, and I also always want to grow our presence as well-rounded, fabulous flute players who really support and care for each other. I would love to make that happen for any of your listeners out there. And so any of them can feel free to reach out to me or contact you and get in touch with me. And I would be happy to continue the conversation that we started today.
Yeah, you are such a generous person with your time. And so for the listeners out there, she means that. She really genuinely means like, hey, I'm here. Use me as a resource. In the few times that we have met, I know that you love helping people. And so, like Emma said, reach out because she is there.
It's hard to share everything in an hour, but briefly, I started off life as a preemie baby. I was born at 24 weeks, so I was 3 months early. And I like to tell my colleagues and my students and just remind myself that it's all about taking our next step and really enjoying the journey and discovering for ourselves and really sinking into that process and realizing that, the best musicians and the flutists that we admire the most are still developing and growing at all ages. And whether you're 16 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or beyond, it's still the first day of the next journey. And my other favorite thing to think of is that no never really means no. No means find another way.
Yep.
And for myself, that is so important. And I think that we often get a little caught up with fighting over the same piece of cheese with our colleagues. And I don't mean to say that just flute players do that. I think across the board, we kind of get worried that if I don't get that gig, there'll never be another one. And so I tend to really want instead to focus on the idea of making more cheese instead of all of us trying to scrap for something. We can just make more opportunities for each other and for ourselves. And that really develops our whole world, because really when you sit next to somebody on a plane and you tell them that you're a flutist, that's probably the first time that person has ever heard of that being a possibility of a thing. Yeah. And so we're such a small part of the universe, and we want to give back as much as we can, but also help our small corner grow.
I'm going to end on that note because I can't say anything else that would top it. Do you love seeing children excited about learning music and playing the flute? KinderFlute classes are carefully designed to create a love of learning. During the teacher training classes, flute teachers learn how to integrate games and movement into their classes to both motivate and maximize learning potential. The movement activities and games are foundational to helping the students maintain a keen sense of alertness. Not only does KinderFlute motivate students, but also the teacher training classes has energized and transformed many studios. The ideas from the teacher training classes can be applied to students from ages 4 through 12. The next U.S. training class will be this summer, July 8th through the 11th, but it's not too early to sign up. The available spaces are limited, so it's best to sign up as early as possible. They will be held just north of Pittsburgh, and the housing is at the beautiful Eden Hall at Chatham University. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBegay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.